So if we flip to the next slide, I do want to touch on a question you might have, which is how does lead actually get into drinking water? Yep, can you hear me? So it's important to note that lead, it rarely comes from source water like Lake Michigan or the water at your water utility. Instead, lead can get into our drinking water from water service lines if they're made of lead, or it can get into our drinking water from internal plumbing with leaded material. So lead from these materials, it can get into the drinking water when something called corrosion occurs, or like an actual wearing away of the pipe. And water utilities, they do try to prevent the corrosion of pipes by feeding chemicals into the water that help create kind of a protective coating on the inside of the pipe. However, lead can still wear away and leach into the water, and then lead pipes can also be disturbed and unpredictably release lead particulate into water. When present, lead service lines are actually the largest potential source of lead in drinking water. And lead service lines, what they do is they deliver water to your home from the water main in the street. Lead service lines, they were banned in 1986. So if you live in an older home, you may be connected to one of these lines. So on the next slide, I do want to talk about some ways to address lead in drinking water. Because lead service lines are the largest potential source of lead in water, the best first step for addressing lead in drinking water is to identify the presence of these lines and remove and replace the entire line. Because this can be very costly for a homeowner to undertake on their own, MPC is going to share a statewide solution to this issue shortly. In addition to tackling lead service lines, it's also important to identify and remove any internal plumbing that may contain leaded material. And then I do recognize that these are some costly fixes, so there are some low-cost routine actions you can take at home to address lead in drinking water in the short term. So you can do things like cleaning the aerators or the screen at the tip of your faucet and using NSF 53 certified water pitchers or like faucet mount filters. So those are some things you can do in the short term. So now that we know a little bit about lead and how it can get into our drinking water, I do want to touch on a few recent successes in Illinois to begin to address lead in water. Back in 2017, we had legislation passed. And what that legislation did, it's actually, you can look at it in more detail. It's Public Act 990922. And that requires community water systems to identify the material of their water service lines, including if it's made of lead. So that's a good step for identifying where these lead service lines are located. In addition to that component, the legislation also requires schools and certain childcare facilities to test their drinking water for lead, and Elevate has been really active on the childcare testing front. We were really excited to see Illinois pass legislation that addresses lead and water testing at childcare facilities. And this is because children, they really do spend a lot of time in these facilities. And the only way to confirm a facility's drinking water has lead is to test it, because you can't see it, you can't taste it. You need to test the water. If we flip to the next slide, Illinois is one of only about 10 states in the country that requires lead and water testing at childcare facilities. So it was great to see Illinois emerge as a leader on this front. What the new requirements do is childcare providers, they need to test all of their drinking and cooking water sources that are used for childcare operations for lead, and then develop and implement a mitigation plan if they find lead in their water at 2.01 parts per billion or above. And we can go ahead and turn to the next slide. But given Elevate's experience working with nonprofit childcare facilities here in Chicago on lead and water testing and mitigation, we knew that the childcare community was really going to need a lot of technical guidance and assistance and financial support to comply with the new testing requirement. So what Elevate did is we worked with the Environmental Defense Fund and Illinois Action for Children to develop an online training series and in-person workshops for providers. And what we do during these workshops is we talk about the health impact of lead on children's health, how it gets into drinking water, and then we walk them through how to sample your water and short to long-term mitigation options if they do find lead in their drinking water. We turn to the next slide. In addition to these in-person workshops, we also developed a lead and water resource program for home-based providers in Chicago. And what we do with this program is we reimbursed home-based providers in our region for their testing costs. And then we also provided them with free access to short-term mitigation tools, such as those NSF 53 certified filter products, to at least get them through about a year or two with those short-term products. And then if you flip to the next slide, we also have a bilingual call center at Elevate Energy. So during that program, providers were able to call into our call center and ask questions about the requirements, about how to address lead. And then we also connected them with training videos and communication templates for communicating with their childcare community. And then finally, on this last slide, you'll see that we also hosted day-long trainings with childcare trainers in Illinois. And we did this because we wanted to have all parts of the state kind of get the word out about the new lead and water testing requirements to childcare providers. So that's just a little overview of what Elevate has been doing to support these new requirements and really helping the childcare community address lead in drinking water. At this point, I want to turn it over to Justin to talk about a long-term solution for addressing lead in water. And I just can't stress enough how much I think that what Justin is going to introduce, it's really going to help the childcare community with mitigation of lead in drinking water. And it's really just going to set our future generations up for significant economic and health benefits in the future. So with that, I will turn it over to Justin.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm Justin Williams. I'm with the Metropolitan Planning Council. I'm an associate there, and I coordinate our legislative agenda as well as provide research support on various policy issues, including lead in drinking water. There we go. So I just want to start by talking a little bit about the scope of the lead service line problem in Illinois. What you're seeing here is a map of known and potential lead service line distribution by county throughout the state of Illinois. What you're seeing here is known and potential, right? This comes from an inventory, the inventory that Caroline introduced in her set of slides, which is self-reported by utilities. Some utilities are doing a much more thorough job than others in reporting the material compositions of their service lines. There are some utilities that don't know a substantial, like 85, 90% plus of the composition of their service lines, right? So we know there are 686,000 or so lead service lines throughout the state. There may be up to 1 million more. Takeaways here are we don't have really an accurate picture of where lead service lines are in Illinois, but nevertheless, we know they're a statewide problem with statewide costs that's going to require state resources to adequately address. Next slide, please. One back. Oh, okay. Yep, you can go on ahead. So there are a handful of policies that states have established to support the replacement of lead service lines. States like Michigan are doing some of the most aggressive things. They have goals like timelines for replacement set in place. They enable utilities to recoup replacement costs through rate increases, in addition to the inventory and disclosure requirements that states like Illinois have. What you're seeing here is Illinois Environmental Council's attempt to move Illinois towards a more robust and comprehensive bill that would address lead service lines in Illinois, sort of taking all of the known mechanisms into account, right? So Illinois Environmental Council has been running a version of this bill for the last few sessions. Last year, we got close. We got the water utilities on board, and we were hoping that we were going to get some funding to back up a lead service line replacement program throughout the state. That didn't ultimately materialize in the capital bill for us, and so we didn't move the bill forward last year. In 2020, we're advocating for a lead service line replacement program again. And here are the basics of the bill, some of which are still in negotiation, are still being developed. So what this graph shows you, what this chart shows you, is that there are basically, there's one big requirement, which is for utilities throughout the state to inventory all service lines more comprehensively than they currently do. Making special note of any lead service lines in their inventory, plan for their replacement, right? Come up with a plan to figure out how they're going to get lead service lines out of their water distribution system. And then finally, replace all of those lead service lines throughout the state. The thing that I want to call attention to about this bill is that we're really centering two things as we develop this. The first is equity. We want to make sure that every resident in Illinois who has a lead service line attached to their home can afford to have it replaced, right? And by afford to, we mean create a dedicated funding source that will enable utilities to go out and replace the full lead service line in its entirety from main to house. That we think is really the only way to guarantee that this is going to happen for all households. Another big component of this is going to be a low-income rate assistance program that ensures that once households have their lead service line replaced, they have affordable access to safe drinking water. So equity is a really important component of the bill. We're making sure that's embedded through every stage of it, from inventory to replacement. Additionally, we want to make sure that utilities can actually achieve this goal. We want to make sure that utilities have the technical resources they need to go out and inventory the pipes in their system. We want to make sure there's dedicated staff at Illinois EPA to oversee the program. And again, really importantly, dedicated funding to make sure that utilities can actually go do this, and it's not just an unfunded mandate to go out and replace all of their lead service lines. Next slide, please. So one thing we want to stress, and that has become increasingly apparent as we negotiate this bill and continue to work through it, is that the benefits of replacing lead service lines go well beyond the already substantial consequence of removing lead from our drinking water, right? So in addition to the health benefits, so it's been estimated that, you know, we could save $22,000 per line in cardiovascular disease costs alone if we replaced every lead service line in the state. We can make sure that communities are not entering a lead in drinking water crisis as easily as they have been, right? Like every time a community like Flint, Michigan, like University Park has a lead in drinking water crisis, they're spending millions and millions of dollars shipping in bottled water, dealing with lawsuits derived from failure to act. You know, these costs pile up and we're already paying for them. Is the thing that we've increasingly come to realize about this problem. Better to get out ahead of this problem and make sure we're taking care of it now. Additionally, you know, the current time we're living in, it's become really apparent that, you know, we need to increase our resilience to unexpected shocks like the pandemic we're facing now. It's not lost on MPC that, you know, we've got children throughout the state of Illinois staying at home and drinking out of potentially lead service lines, and thereby increasing their exposure to lead in drinking water as compared with being at school. It's not guaranteed, right, but there may be an increased exposure risk there. And additionally, an aggressive lead service line replacement program could really help Illinois bounce back from this. We've estimated that a lead service line replacement program could create up to 144,000 jobs, and these are decades-long jobs, right? These are entire careers made by this aggressive lead service line program. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the state bill that Illinois Environmental Council is working on to get lead service lines out. And with that, I'll turn it back to Iyana.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to kind of wrap up with, following what Caroline and Justin said and talking a little bit about, continuing to talk about lead in drinking water, but focusing on what's happening at the city and providing some updates and also providing some tools that you can use individually to stop lead from getting in your drinking water. So first, I'll give a little brief introduction about IEC. So we are a nonpartisan organization. We've been around since 1975, and we really came together with the idea that we needed a singular, strong voice on behalf of the environment in Springfield. So we had groups like Sierra Club and the Audubon Society basically come together in a way to represent and have pull together our resources so we can be even more powerful. And so we're continuing that mission today, and so now we represent over 80 environmental groups throughout the state of Illinois. So these are some of our affiliate members. These are our lead affiliate members, and then obviously we have several more. And so what exactly does IEC do? So our main focus is promoting sound environmental laws and policies. And so part of that work is actually tracking up to 250 environmental bills each session. So these are bills that are pro-environment or anti-environment, or sometimes are introduced as pro-environment by people who have no input from us, our affiliate members. So we're always on the, we're always making sure that we're tracking those bills and killing the really bad bills. And then the next part is environmental news. So this is either through our newsletters or through our blogs, our action alerts. But overall, it's with the goal that we are informing our affiliate members and the general public about the state of the environment in Illinois and the state of environmental legislation. And then also another part of our work is facilitating a statewide advocacy network. So obviously that's coordinating over 80 different environmental groups. And so really what we're doing here is basically allocating our resources and our expertise from our members in a way that's most efficient and most effective. And then building relationships with legislators. So in some ways, for example, in the top left corner, we had a lobby day in DC. And so part of that is actually like direct lobbying, or we have lobby days where we have our affiliate members and we have people from the general public talking to the lawmakers. And sometimes it's also informal. So at the top right corner, we have Colleen, our legislative director, and some lawmakers that visited a farm down in Springfield. These are other ways that we can build relationships that aren't necessarily just revolved around a specific bill, but just environmental issues in general. And finally, we released our environmental scorecard for state legislators. And so this kind of ties into the idea of having a relationship, right? Because in a relationship, it's about holding each other accountable. And so with our environmental scorecard, it's a tool to hold elected officials accountable by scoring them based on their voting record and their sponsorship record of bills. So it's a way to kind of motivate lawmakers, and then in a way, sometimes a little slight shaming of lawmakers who aren't exactly environmentally friendly. And so I'm going to go ahead and just start with our Chicago updates in the timeline. Sorry, I don't know why it translated a little bit weird, but so everybody, I'm pretty sure people are aware that up until 1986, lead service lines were allowed to be installed throughout the United States, including Illinois, and the city of Chicago actually mandated that they be installed until 1986. And so between there and 2009, obviously no more lead service lines were no more lead service lines were put in. And then finally in 2009, Rahm Emanuel, his administration introduced the Meter Safe program. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a few points of why that's important and why that ties into lead legislation. One thing I do want to make clear is that this Meter Safe program was actually a result of $481 million that the administration took out in water conservation loans that went towards the Meter Safe program as well as other conservation programs. And it also is what led to a steady increase in water bills for residents in order to pay back those loans. In 2003, the U.S. EPA did a Chicago water study, and they found that the lead levels in tap water could spike for up to months and years. This is following, this wasn't related to meters, but it was related to water main replacements or repairs. And then finally, and then following up in 2016, the Chicago Park District started testing their water fountains. They found that a lot of the water fountains were below the 15 parts per billion, the EPA action level, but there were quite a few that were actually above what the FDA limits for drinking water in bottled water. And there were some that were like up to 10 times greater than the EPA action level for actual tap water. That same year, the city commissioned the water quality study. So this was studying the impact of meter installations and water main replacement on nearby metered homes. And so in November 2018, the city released the results from the water quality study. The city had actually found earlier in that year, in June, about the results of it, and the results actually found that 1 in 5 of the 250 homes that were part of the study had elevated lead levels above the EPA's 15 parts per billion. And that was kind of important because it kind of confirmed what a lot of people felt, including those who were metered. And then that same year, the city actually contracted a study with CDM Smith, their global engineering firm, and this was kind of a stepping stone towards figuring out how much would it actually cost and what's the feasibility of doing a lead service line replacement in Chicago. And then fast forward to June 2019, Mayor Lightfoot suspended the meter program. The last meter was actually installed on June 28, 2019. And this was again after they found the results that 1 in 5 homes were testing above EPA action levels. And then in August 2019, the Virginia Tech did a Chicago study. And this was in the Southside community, so this was through community groups testing their water at home, and they found that a third of those tested homes had water that was greater than 5 parts per billion, which again is the FDA limit for lead in drinking water in water bottles. And then in September 2019, the city budgeted for the lead service line replacement pilot program. And so here we are today in 2020, and in February 2020, the city is planning basically to reintroduce the meter safe program, but they want to first do a pilot program to figure out if a new ultrasonic meter will actually increase or increase lead levels before and after it's installed. But obviously, with everything that's going on right now, it's still kind of up in the air whether or not that's going to continue. But at least at the end of February, that's what the city was having in mind. And then this is kind of just like a summary of where we're at. So there's 392 lead service lines in Chicago, 165,000 metered customers. The Chicago Water Quality Study is still continuing, and they have a goal of testing 1,200 homes in Chicago. The Chicago Park District, they continue their seasonal flushing, and then they're also replacing and removing old water fountains connected to lead pipes. The Department of Water Management each year replaces 100 miles of water mains each year. I've highlighted that because that's what they're doing, but they're not actually coordinating that along with lead service line replacement. So as Justin talked about, the lead service line replacement bill, the reason why we want to actually have cities to have a plan is so that each year the city of Chicago is replacing these water mains, it should be coordinated with lead service line replacement so that they're not going back and costing more time and more taxpayer money. And then finally, the city of Chicago, in their 2019 to 2023 capital improvement plan, they outlined the replacement of 880 miles of water pipes. So they do actually have that in their plan, but it's not clear how that's coordinated with water main replacement. So that's kind of like a general overview or update from the city. The last thing I do want to provide is a few things that you can do in the meantime. So part of it is requiring a testing kit. So if you are a resident of Chicago, and especially if you are metered, please visit chicagowaterquality.org. You can be able to get a testing kit, and if your water tests high enough, you can actually get a filter, and it'll provide you replacement cartridges as well. Let's say if you don't want to like testing or you don't get back that high enough results, but you're still concerned, you should purchase a National Science Foundation water filter and make sure that that filter actually is certified to filter out lead. And then in Chicago, they actually cover the cost of testing in doctor's office for children's blood levels. And then if you're just curious about general information, please look up the Search Illinois Lead Program, and then the Illinois Department of Public Health has a general website with information. And then lastly, please write to your elected officials so that you encourage them to support our lead service line replacement bill. This was the previous bill number, and it's likely to change. But please make sure even if you're not pointing to specific legislation, you're just emphasizing the need that legislation in general needs to be aimed towards lead service line replacement that's expedited and is not costing taxpayers an obscene amount of money. So that's kind of where the cities are right now. This is what you can do right now. And right now we're going to hop into the Q&A part. And so if you are on the phone, press *9 if you have a question. And if you're on the actual computer, feel free to type out your message in the chat box.
Awesome. Thanks, Iyana. And I know you've stopped sharing your screen, so I can maybe share one of mine. We're getting a lot of questions coming in about the lead service line bill specifically, and maybe it's helpful first to talk about like where Illinois is. How do we compare to other states? Where we, to go back to Justin, maybe you can give a little bit more there. And let me see if I can share this screen that maybe helps provide some of that information. But Justin, do you want to answer just again, like some of what's on this slide about where Illinois compares in not only this plan, but just, again, estimated number of lead service lines?
Yeah, so Illinois has more lead service lines than any state in the country, with an estimated 686,000 to 1.92 million. That 415,000 number is actually a little bit old. Some of the states doing actions, like state level policy actions, are listed here. This is just a small sample of what states are doing. If you go to the Lead Service Line Replacement Collaborative website, which is where this screenshot is taken from, they have a lot of information about this kind of stuff. Illinois, as you can see on this list, has a mandatory inventory requirement for community water supplies, thanks to Illinois Environmental Council in 2017. Additionally has some modest disclosure requirements. If anybody has bought a home recently, they know that they were given a form that asks them that the seller has to fill out, that says something to the effect of, do you know that there is a lead in drinking water health problem on your property? Which of course is a very vague kind of thing to be asking. I don't remember the exact language, but it's sufficiently vague that it allows sellers to, even if they know they have a lead service line, to not say as much when they sell the home. Additionally, there are some notification requirements in Illinois when utilities go to replace a lead service line, and that's what that mandate replacement practices category means. What we don't have, and what we would really like to see Illinois have, is this set goal category, which is, can we get utilities to set timelines and get plans for when they're actually going to get lead service lines replaced? Michigan, again, is one of the models as far as states go on this issue. In addition to state level actions, there are also local government actions, municipal actions that some cities throughout the country are taking, like Newark, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., Cincinnati. These are some of the big players in this space. Yeah, Caroline, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Oh, Caroline, you're muted.
One thing I wanted to add, I actually just saw a question come in about if there are maps that show the location of lead surface lines. Ohio is one state where you can actually access maps, but there are actually close to a dozen communities in the state of Illinois that have actually put their lead service line inventories online, and you can type in the address and actually see if the line connected to your home, the water service line, is made of lead, and they'll often let you know if it's there's like a portion running underneath public property and a portion running underneath private property. They can kind of tell you by looking at the map if it's a full lead service line, a partial lead service line. So I'm going to go ahead and enter kind of our blog post that we have here at Elevate that has some of that information. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
That's great. And Oh, there we go. I know also, Justin, maybe if you could speak to, there was a question about specifically in the bill that we've introduced, which for this year is Senate Bill 2916, although it doesn't have language attached to it yet. So I put the bill number from last year, which was on Iyana's presentation too, into the chat box. But what are the requirements for utilities as far as when they need to report the presence of lead to local units of government? I think is an interesting question. You know, we can talk about maybe the requirements for the inventory that right now is going to IEPA. But if you want to kind of address how are we making sure in this legislation that not only are utilities identifying lead and other materials, but making sure that the public and government actors are aware.
I should say, as a caveat, that I have not reviewed the particular disclosure parts of the bill recently, but as I understand it, the reporting is being done to IEPA. Presumably, there would be some interaction between water utilities and municipalities. Now, that may become complicated in the instance where a water utility is privately owned, as it is in several communities. Not the majority, not even the biggest part of the state of Illinois. Yeah, I don't know, Josh, Colleen, Iyana, anybody else have any other insight about that?
Yeah, no, oh, and I'll have to unmute Josh. I think that is right. You know, certainly we are interested in once a municipality develops a lead service line replacement, how do you ensure that the public is notified of that plan, has an opportunity to comment on it, to understand what that plan means for that community? There are a lot of specifics in the bill about what a lead service line replacement plan has to have, and prioritization. I know Justin covered a lot of the equity components here, but prioritization of vulnerable communities, how you're going to hire from minority contractors and all sorts of things will be part of a plan that we really want to make sure that communities are aware of. So I think, again, as Justin already outlined, this is certainly about transparency too. We did get some other questions that I'll see whoever wants to answer them. One was about the issue of lead in well water. Is that something that we know about? And if so, how is that problem addressed? And maybe just speaking even to what we know about wells in general. And then as a follow-up, how would you as a homeowner go about, I think it was Don asked how he can add lead testing in his repertoire. Is there anything that you as an individual do? I know Iyana covered City of Chicago, but those are two questions you guys want.
This is Iyana. So, sorry, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, you can go first and I'll go after you.
I was just going to address the part about well testing. So from my understanding, the well testing, if it's a private well, it isn't required to be tested by the state. So you could get a private contractor to come and test it, but the state won't actually come and test it for lead for you. That's all I had to say about that. That was my take on the lead, the well part.
To add to the well part, my understanding is that there could be potentially certain parts in the well that may have leaded material, but I'm not sure how common that actually is. I've heard something about the screens, but please don't mark my word on it. That's what I've heard. I really appreciated the other question. What can you do if you're looking at your home and you want to better understand your potential for lead exposure in your own home? I think one thing to do, in addition to what was talked about a little bit earlier in terms of lead and water testing, you can do a visual inspection to see if you have a lead service line in your home. NPR actually has a really great website that walks you through kind of looking where the water service line enters your home. You can kind of do a scratch and a visual test. So I'll include that link in our chat box so folks can look. For some people, they are able to kind of see if at least where it's entering the home, if it's made of lead. And if you do have a lead service line, if you're unable to replace it because it is very expensive for a homeowner to undertake on their own, then you would want to use those NSF 53 filters that we talked about a little bit earlier, either a faucet mount or a water pitcher. You can even stick them into your fridge. If you have a water dispenser, you can get NSF 53 certified filters there. So identification of the lead service line, using filters, and then of course you can do the lead and water testing. And if you don't have a free lead and water testing program through your water utility, IEPA has a whole list of labs that will, you can get water bottles from them in the mail. And I found some that go as low as about $12 to $15 per sample. So I can share that list as well. So those are just a few ideas.
That's great. Thanks, Caroline. And I know we also had a previous question about lead in garden hoses, which is a significant issue. IEC actually introduced a bill to ban them this year. But I think overall, when you're thinking about sources of lead in your home, that is also something that you should be considering, whether or not you potentially have a leaded garden hose. There were a couple questions, and Justin, Caroline, Iyana, related to testing. How are folks living in apartments and condos? And so maybe that gets a little bit to like, what are we talking about when we talk about a lead service line? Because there are some properties that are at higher risk than others, right? And then I also saw a question about the chemicals that we add to our water to try and prevent some of this, and maybe speaking to what are those chemicals? Are they effective? What happens when they're not? And some lessons learned from some communities that have had lead issues.
Yeah, in terms of where are you at most risk of having a lead service line connected to your home? That's a really great question. So it's really those smaller homes. So like a single family home or a 1 to 4 unit building, because of the size of lead service lines. They're smaller. So you're not going to have these small pipes connected to larger buildings or big businesses. So I would say if you're in an older home that's a single family home, or maybe a 1 to 4 unit that was built before 1986, then that's where you have the potential of being connected to a lead service line. It's not to say that it can't be connected to other types of facilities, but that's where you're going to see it more common.
Anything? Okay, wasn't sure if Justin's trying to jump in there. And then, okay, I see some good questions coming in through the chat. One question that we haven't gotten yet, which I'm a little bit surprised by, because it's the question that those of us in Springfield get every time we talk about lead, is how much are we talking about? And what are the costs and how do we pay for it? And to that, I am going to kick it over to Justin to talk a little bit about, this is the biggest issue. The state has the biggest problem in the country. What are we going to do? How are we going to pay for it?
Yeah, fair question. So I always like to lead this discussion by talking about what we're already paying in order to enjoy the privilege of drinking lead poisoned water, which is, I want to return to that $22,000 per line that we're already paying in cardiovascular disease costs in order to just be in the status quo, right? So I just want to, and then there's additionally like the amount of money saved on potential lead in drinking water crises. Right, so just like for perspective, I want to set that out there as the frame through which we should be looking at this, right? And then more directly, how much is it going to cost? We estimate about $8,000 per service line to replace. That seems to be from a sweep of the cities doing this throughout the country on the high end of what this should cost, but at $8,000 per line, replacing every service line in the state over 40 years is probably going to be about $8 billion is the number we're looking at. Again, that's over 40 years, right? So in terms of any individual year, it's going to be much less than that, right? As we're talking about that, the immediate question is how you can pay for that. We're still working out the exact mechanism that's going to be used to pay for this. We think a fee, a user fee on a water bill as low as $20 per year, so we're talking about a couple bucks a month, should be able to finance the replacement of every lead service line in the state. Coupled with that, we're also looking again at this low-income rate assistance program, which would be greater than the annual fee, and therefore would be able to reduce hardships for many, many households in the state.
Great.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Iyana.
I wanted to address something that Colleen said earlier, because she was talking about the lead service lines and what buildings are most at risk. But you also asked a really good question about like the actual chemicals and like, do they actually stop lead from getting into the water? And so a lot of people, for example, for the case of the Flint water crisis, they did have an orthophosphate coating. It's a chemical coating that basically acts as a barrier between the lead pipe and the actual water. And what ended up happening in Flint was that they switched the water supply, and it was more corrosive, and that's what ended up causing it to leach into the water. The same thing happened in University Park, where in that case, though, it wasn't lead pipes, so it was actually like lead fixtures and solder within the home. But the same thing happened where they had a corrosion control program with the orthophosphate coating, but they switched from groundwater to the Kankakee River, which was more corrosive. Or higher pH. I'm not a chemist by any means, but it had a different chemistry, and so that's what ended up causing it to leach into the water. So I think when we talk about the city of Chicago and other places that have lead service lines, even though they're using these corrosion controls, there is in danger that if anything happens, if there's any type of difference in the pH level or chemistry in the water, there's a huge risk that literally hundreds of thousands of homes and residents could be poisoned just by, and not even knowing, just because it's a simple change in the chemistry of the water. So I just wanted to address that, because I feel like that was really important, and it's something that isn't necessarily always the first thought when we talk about lead service lines.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tanisha. And Iyana, Tanisha just asked a question in the chat. We have been talking to IPA, and I know there are some folks listening in from there about what we need to make sure communities do when they are thinking about switching sources or switching corrosion control techniques, to make sure that what's happening in the communities, like Iyana just mentioned, doesn't happen in the future. But Caroline, were you going to jump in there as well?
I was just going to add to the orthophosphate conversation. Just something I have found really interesting is that the city of Madison and the city of Denver, they actually found it more cost effective to replace their lead service lines. And one of the reasons for that is the use of phosphates increases nutrient pollution, and they have some tight nutrient standards. And so for them, the cost of removing that from their water was really expensive, and it was more cost effective in the long term to stop using as much of the phosphates in the water. So I found that really interesting. Just a little.
Yeah, that's obviously a lot of the folks on this call and members of IEC really care about nutrient pollution. I think that's an interesting connection people don't really think about. Another question that I think Cheryl raised that we haven't really talked about is, so take the city of Chicago that sells water to a lot of different municipalities in the surrounding region. How, when it comes to lead, how are those communities impacted? I know the infrastructure is obviously different, right? But if we're talking about the city of Chicago replacing its lead service lines, I think this is something we've given some thought to, and maybe Justin can go farther into that with the bill, but making sure that those communities then aren't getting the cost shift of that burden because they're not the ones that have as much of a problem as the city of Chicago.
We're still working out the finer details of the fee and exactly how it's going to be assessed and collected. That said, we're pretty confident that one provision we're going to put on the collection of the fee is you can't pass that cost on to downstream users. And that's just likely going to be written into the final bill. So that would be the way that we're trying to address it.
Mhm. Yeah. And I know something else we've just talked a lot about with lead, with infrastructure upgrades in general, is that a lot of those communities throughout our state, but certainly there are some communities in the Chicagoland region that have really deteriorated water infrastructure that not only presents problems, as Iyana mentioned, just in general, but certainly in the crisis that we're seeing now, not having access to affordable and clean water is a basic human right and is really problematic during these times. But as we start going and upgrading our water infrastructure to replace lead service lines, we can upgrade our system as a whole and ensure that we have less leaky infrastructure, that we have better systems, and we'll really, Justin made this point, save ourselves a lot of money in a lot of other ways. Someone had a question, Tanisha had a question, are building owners required to get lead service lines replaced? Right now, there's no requirement upon sale or just at all that you have to replace a lead service line. If you're in the city of Chicago, you can get your home tested by calling 311, as Iyana detailed. And yes,
If I could just add to that real quick, I mean, I think that that's one of the reasons why it's so important to have a dedicated funding and revenue mechanism for this, is that individual building owners, number one, if you're a landlord, you may not have an incentive to replace it, right? Because you're basically passing that cost onto your tenants. Now, that's not to say no landlords do or would, right? But just that there's no incentive there to do it. And number two, the utility frequently does not have the money to invest in replacing lead service lines. So it's really important that we're providing the resources so that everyone can be drinking from, at the very least, a water system that doesn't have lead going from the main to the house. That doesn't take care of the entire problem, as I believe it was someone in the chat mentioned before, that there are lead fixtures in the home that may need to be replaced. That's true. We acknowledge that. We're not going to take care of the entire problem, right? But we can take care of the known part for every household in Illinois. And we think that's a vital thing to do, especially given how much of lead in drinking water comes from lead service lines.
Yeah, that last point too about this isn't like an either or type of a conversation. We have to address lead in all of its sources in a systematic way. And that means, yes, we need to address lead paint, but that shouldn't stop us from taking action now to address lead in our drinking water. And certainly we've made a lot of gains in exposure to lead through paint. So sometimes we hear that from people trying to tell us to slow down on lead in drinking water, and it needs to be all of the above. And someone asked, should landlords be required to disclose what they know about lead service lines in their rental properties to tenants? There is, lead paint disclosure right now that's required, and there was legislation passed in, I think, 2017 that requires remediation for home sales of lead paint. So I think this is definitely something we're having conversations about. Obviously, this bill is focused first and foremost of replacing lead service lines. And so I think as we move forward and do all that, then you wouldn't need to disclose, right? We'll get to a place where we don't have them because there is no safe level of lead in our water. I wonder too, we have 7 or 8 minutes left. If maybe from the conversation that we've had or the questions that we're seeing come in, if Caroline, Iyana, Justin, you have other things that we maybe didn't get at or you just want to mention to kind of ground this conversation. Don't all jump at once.
I mean, I just think Justin did a really nice job just talking about the economic and future health benefits of taking action now. You know, this problem isn't going to go away. It's going to be here until we actually permanently address it. And I can't think of anything. It's going to have so many future benefits for our most vulnerable population and for future generations to come. So I just hope we all keep that in mind. Yes, I get it's going to be difficult to do and expensive, but there are so many benefits that will come from doing this.
Absolutely.
I think I would say, Iyana, were you jumping in? Sorry, I didn't. I think that we acknowledge that this is going to be a tough ask in this particular political environment that we're entering. And I think that we're increasingly coming to understand that we can't not do this, right? I mean, we've got children staying at home right now in homes and maybe exposed to higher levels of lead as a result. We have people throughout Illinois who will be eager to get back to work, and this could be a pretty serious economic stimulus package. And I hope that with this issue and with many issues that the Illinois Environmental Council is facing, that we can continue to carry that message forward, that we have to do this stuff, and we acknowledge that times are going to be hard, but in order to be resilient to anything like this that may happen in the future, we need to address these problems, and doing so may actually help us bounce back some.
Yeah. On that last point too, I mean, I think right now we have a shelter in place order statewide, and if you're in a home where you can't depend on your water source, we're talking about life and death situations, and turning people to any sources of water they can. There was good, you just saw the count. I was gonna say we had a question about the maximum allowed of lead in drinking waters in schools, and actually, if you're, there was a discussion about school testing. If you're curious what your local school has as far as lead or what's been done, you can reach out to IEC and Elevate and MPC. There's that information publicly accessible. Iyana, sorry, I may have jumped in before you had a chance. Okay, just checking our chat for any other questions here.
I think I was on mute. I'm sorry. I think I was on mute. I saw myself talking, and then, okay. I just wanted to real quick, just go off of what Justin said, and there definitely are hard times coming, but I think understanding that we need to do this, and again, to Colleen's point, people already can't afford their water. We need to talk about that. We need to tie in this connecting to water affordability. And if people can't afford their water and it's poisoned and there's a recession, my brain's kind of all over the place. My thing is I just want to really solidify that this is really important, not only for public health reasons, but the economic impacts, not only now, but down the road of not having access to clean, affordable water. And that's my little bit on that.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And if obviously the 80 folks we had on the line today really care about this issue, are concerned, not just for them as individuals or for their family or for their community or for our state. If you're thinking about other ways to help, during this time of advocacy, I think just thinking through, what's happening in your community. We talked a little bit about Chicago, but certainly this is an issue statewide and beyond just lead service lines. We are pushing in Springfield to have all parks tested. Iyana mentioned that Chicago Park District has already done this, but others haven't. Talk with your local elected officials when the time is right about this issue. Obviously, we're all being first and foremost ensuring that people have water that they need and the resources they need during this time. But clean, accessible, affordable drinking water, lead-free drinking water is part of that. So I'll turn it back over to Iyana to close us out.
You're muted again.
Sorry, my audio doesn't work on my computer, so it's all on my phone. Thank you everybody again for coming to our IEC Lunch and Learn. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email me, Justin, or Caroline. I don't think I have my information on there, but it's Iyana, IYANA @ilenviro.org. If you have any questions about follow-up information, please feel free to reach out to us. And yeah, thank you everybody for participating and wanting to be informed.